The crowd outside the Donovan Ranch had never been so still. Gideon Donovan stood on the top rail of the split-cedar fence, his sun-bronzed hand gripping the post so hard his knuckles had gone white beneath the weathering. Below him stretched nearly 60 people, ranch hands and townsfolk, and rival cattlemen from 3 counties, all gathered for the late summer livestock auction that had become the social event of the Cimarron Valley. They had come expecting the usual spectacle of horn and hoof and hard-driving bids. What they got instead was something none of them would forget for the rest of their lives. Gideon's voice cracked out across the yard like a bullwhip, sharp and absolutely certain, carrying over the lowing of cattle and the buzz of flies in the August heat of 1878. "She arrived with nothing," he said, loud enough that the men on the far fence line turned and looked. "Not a coin to her name, not a single soul in this territory who would vouch for her, and she outworked every man here." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it, the kind that presses down on a crowd like a coming thunderhead. There were men in that crowd who had laughed at Jane Sutton. Men who had placed quiet wagers on how many days she would last before she dragged her sorry self back to wherever she had come from. Men who had deliberately piled her workload with impossible tasks, hoping to watch her break. And now, the most respected cattleman in all of the Cimarron Valley was standing on a fence post in front of God and everyone, proclaiming her worth with the kind of conviction most men reserved for Scripture. Some of those men felt the heat of shame rising into their faces. Others felt something darker, something more dangerous, because they understood that what Gideon Donovan was really saying had nothing to do with cattle work at all. Gideon's eyes found Jane across the yard where she stood with a branding iron still cooling in her gloved hand, her dark hair escaping its pin in the wind, her jaw set in that particular angle she carried when she was fighting back something she didn't want anyone to see. Her green eyes were wide, and something unreadable was moving through them. He had not told her he was going to do this. She had not expected any of it. And neither of them were prepared for what it was going to cost them when the hidden motives of the men gathered in that crowd came flooding out into the open. But to understand why that moment mattered so completely, why those words landed with the force of something that had been building for the better part of a year, you have to go back to the February morning, when Jane Sutton stepped off the southbound stage in the frozen town of Caldwell, Kansas, with every possession she owned folded into a carpet bag the size of a man's boot. The winter of 1878 came into Kansas like something with a personal grudge. The Arkansas River had frozen solid enough to drive a wagon across, and the wind off the plains had a cutting edge to it that made grown cowboys pray out loud. Caldwell was a cattle town, a rough-edged, hard-drinking, wide-open kind of place that served as a staging point for the big drives pushing north along the Kishom Trail. It was not a town that welcomed strangers gently, and it had never once been kind to women who arrived alone. Jane Sutton had arrived alone. She was 24 years old, which in the world of 1878 Kansas meant she was already considered something past the conventional marrying age by the women who ran the town's social register, and spent their Sundays discussing other people's business in low voices over coffee after church. She had come from Missouri, from a small river town east of Joplin, where her family had been tenant farmers on land that had ground them slowly down to nothing over the course of 20 years. Her father had died the previous autumn from a fever that should not have killed a man his age, but did because they had no money for a proper doctor. Her mother had followed him in December, which Jane believed had as much to do with grief as with the cold. Her 2 older brothers had already scattered years before, one to Colorado, one into a silence that probably meant something worse. She had sold what little the farm produced, paid what debts she could, and gotten onto a stage with $11.30, a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, and a stubborn, absolute refusal to be finished. She had heard about the Donovan Ranch through a letter posted on a bulletin board at a general store outside of Joplin. It was a simple advertisement, the kind ranches posted when the spring roundup season was approaching and they needed more hands. It said nothing about gender requirements because in 1878, when a cattleman posted a help-wanted notice, it was simply assumed that men would answer it. No one had thought to specify. Jane had answered it anyway. She had written a careful letter, clear-handed and precise, listing her experience with cattle from her father's farming years, her ability to ride, her familiarity with horses, and the kind of hard physical work that most women in town dresses had never been asked to do. She had not mentioned that she was a woman until the second-to-last line, and she had done it matter-of-factly, without apology, because she had already decided she would not apologize for what she was. The reply she received 3 weeks later was curt and confusing. It said that the position was still available and that she should report to the Donovan Ranch outside Caldwell no later than the 1st of March. It was signed by someone named Holt, who turned out to be Gideon Donovan's ranch foreman, and who had, in fact, not read her letter carefully enough to register the detail about her being a woman. So when Jane Sutton stepped off the stage in Caldwell, Kansas, on the 22nd of February, 1878, and hired a local boy with a mule to drive her the 7 miles south to the Donovan Ranch, the person waiting at the gate to receive new hands was Holt Briggs, a raw-boned, tobacco-chewing man of 45 who had spent his entire adult life on ranches, and who stared at Jane Sutton for so long, when she climbed down off the mule cart, that she thought perhaps he had suffered some kind of episode. "You are Jane Sutton," Holt said. It was not a question. It was a man trying to reorganize his understanding of reality. "I am," she said. "You wrote the letter." "I did." He looked at her carpet bag. He looked at the February sky. He looked back at her. "The boss is going to have something to say about this," he muttered, and turned and walked toward the main house without another word. Jane picked up her carpet bag and followed him. The Donovan Ranch was not what she had expected, which is to say it was larger, more serious, and considerably more impressive. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure built from timber and stone that spoke of money spent carefully rather than lavishly. Beyond it spread a complex of barns and working pens and bunkhouses that stretched far enough across the winter-brown flats that Jane had to turn her head to take it all in. There were cattle visible in every direction, dark shapes moving through the frost-pale grass, and the smell of the place was the rich, animal, working smell of a ranch that was genuinely alive. She had barely finished looking around when the front door of the main house opened, and Gideon Donovan walked out. Her first thought, which she was deeply annoyed to have, was that he was handsome in the specific, inconvenient way that made it difficult to think clearly. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, with the lean, efficient build of a man who did real physical work rather than just supervising it. He was perhaps 30, maybe 32, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had been stubbled since probably Tuesday. His eyes were a deep, dark brown, the kind that gave away nothing without permission, and he was carrying his hat in one hand with the easy, unconscious habit of a man entirely comfortable in his own life. He looked at Jane. He looked at Holt. He looked back at Jane. "Holt," he said, in a voice that was quiet and controlled and absolutely dangerous, "I thought we hired a hand for the spring roundup." "We did, boss," Holt said, with the tone of a man who was going to let someone else explain this. "This is a woman," Gideon said. "I am aware of that," Jane said before Holt could answer. "My letter stated as much. I also stated my experience with cattle and horses going back 12 years, my familiarity with branding, roping, and basic veterinary care, and my willingness to work the same hours and the same conditions as any other hand on this ranch. If your foreman hired me without reading carefully, that is a failing of his attention, not of my qualifications." The silence that followed was arctic and specific. Holt looked at his boots. Gideon looked at Jane with that unreadable dark gaze for a very long moment. "You came from Missouri," he said. "Yes. How did you get here?" "Stage to Caldwell, mule cart from there." "What do you have with you?" She held up the carpet bag. This. Something moved in his expression. It was too fast for her to read. He set his jaw and looked out across the flats for a moment, then back at her. The hands are not going to like it. I expect not, she said. The work is brutal in March. It doesn't ease up until late October. I didn't come here looking for ease, she said. He was quiet again for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he said, Holt, get her settled in the spare room at the east end of the bunkhouse. The one with the separate door. He looked at Jane. You work the same hours as everyone else. Same expectations. I won't make exceptions in either direction, which means you won't get lighter work, but you also won't be made to answer for being a woman. The men give you trouble, you come to me directly. Any man I find making your life deliberately difficult is off this ranch before sundown. Are we understood? Jane held his gaze. Understood. Good, Gideon said, and went back inside without another word. Holt shook his head slowly and spat into the frozen dirt. Lord have mercy, he said quietly, and that was the entirety of his welcome. The first week was the hardest thing Jane Sutton had ever done in her life, and she had lived a life that had not been generous with easy things. There were 11 other hands on the Donovan Ranch at that time of year. By March, the number would grow to nearly 20, as seasonal workers arrived for the roundup. Of the 11 permanent hands, exactly none of them were pleased to see her, and several of them went beyond mere displeasure into an active, grinding resistance designed to make her fail as quickly as possible. The ringleader was a man named Cray, a big, loud, tobacco-scarred cowboy of about 35 who had been on the Donovan Ranch for 6 years, and who seemed to consider her presence a personal insult to the entire institution of ranching. He had a particular genius for assigning her the most miserable tasks while making it look accidental. The coldest, wettest, most physically brutal work always seemed to find its way to Jane in those first days. Fence posts in frozen ground, mucking the worst stalls, night watch in temperatures that dropped below zero. She did all of it without complaint. She did not do it silently, because she understood that silence could be read as suffering, and suffering was exactly what Cray wanted to see. Instead, she worked steadily and kept her face neutral, and occasionally said something dry and practical that made the men nearby laugh in spite of themselves, and she watched Cray's frustration building like water behind a dam. What she had not expected was to encounter Gideon Donovan working alongside his hands. She had grown up understanding that owners of large cattle operations were generally the kind of men who sat on their horses and directed other people's labor. This turned out not to be true of Gideon Donovan. He was out before dawn every morning, working as hard as any man on the property, and he had a specific, deeply knowledgeable relationship with his cattle and his land that told her he had built this ranch with his own hands before he had ever employed anyone else. He did not talk much, but he was present and precise, and when something needed doing he did it, and she respected this about him in the same guarded, reluctant way that she was trying very hard not to respect anything about him at all. On her 4th morning, she was struggling with a length of barbed wire that had come off a section of fence during the previous night's wind. The wire was a particular nightmare in the cold because it had contracted and coiled on itself, and was fighting every attempt to stretch it back to its post. Her hands were bleeding through her gloves, the wire had hooked her coat twice, and she was beginning to consider saying words that would have horrified her mother. She heard boots on frozen ground and looked up. Gideon crouched beside the wire without any ceremony, took hold of it with his own gloved hands, and applied steady, expert tension while she fastened the staple into the post. They worked in silence for a few minutes, moving along the fence line, fixing the damaged section by section. You know barbed wire, he said, not as an observation but as a question. My father strung it, she said. Glidden wire. He was one of the first in our county to use it. Good man to know the new things, Gideon said. He was a good man, she said simply, and left the past tense there in the cold air between them without explanation. He did not push. She appreciated that more than she wanted to, When the last section was fixed, he stood and looked down the fence line and said, without looking at her, "Cray's been giving you the worst assignments." "I noticed," she said. "He does it to new hands he wants gone." "I noticed that too." "Has he said anything directly?" "Nothing I haven't heard before," she said. Gideon turned and looked at her then, and for a moment that single look had so much complicated feeling moving through it that Jane felt her breath do something unsteady in her chest. "He'll push harder before he quits," Gideon said. "Then he'll be disappointed," she said. Something crossed Gideon's face that might have been the very earliest edge of a smile. He pulled on his gloves and walked back toward the barn, and Jane stood in the frozen wind telling herself firmly that she was not watching him go. She failed at this. March arrived, and with it the spring roundup, which brought 8 additional seasonal hands to the Donovan Ranch, doubling the population of the bunkhouse, and adding 8 new pairs of eyes that were not prepared to find a woman among the permanent crew. Jane navigated the first days of this expansion with the careful precision of someone walking through a field they know has landmines, friendly and capable, and refusing to be made invisible. It was during the second week of March that the thing happened which changed the temperature of the whole ranch. A young steer had gotten into a section of rough terrain east of the second pasture and had somehow become tangled in a collapsed section of old fencing in a ravine. These things happened and were generally handled without drama, except that in this case the steer was tangled badly enough that 3 men who tried to get close to it came back with kicks and scrapes for their trouble, and the animal was working itself into a state of panic that was going to get it genuinely injured if someone didn't solve the problem in the next 15 minutes. Jane had been watching from a slight distance, mentally cataloging what she was seeing. She had watched her father handle frightened cattle enough times to know the specific technique involved, the angle of approach, the tone of voice, the patience that panicking animals desperately needed and rarely got. She also knew that no one on that slope was doing it correctly. She walked down into the ravine. She heard someone call out behind her, but she did not stop. She moved slowly, at an angle, not directly at the steer, but just off to its left side, moving in the unhurried rhythm of someone who has nowhere in particular to be and all day to get there. She started talking, not loudly, just a steady low murmur in the tone that her father had called the settling voice, the voice that told a frightened creature that nothing catastrophic was happening here. The steer watched her. She kept moving, slow and diagonal, and kept talking, and slowly, over the course of 4 or 5 minutes, the animal stopped its wild-eyed thrashing and stood breathing hard with its muscles trembling but its feet still. She moved in close. She got her hands on the tangled wire. She worked it free with the kind of deliberate patience that required exactly the opposite of haste, and the men watching from the top of the ravine were quiet in a way that was very different from the quiet of dismissal. When the steer was free, it bolted up the slope and the men scrambled out of its way, and Jane climbed back up out of the ravine and found Gideon Donovan standing at the top, watching her. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "My father," she said, the same way she had answered the barbed wire question, the same quiet past tense that said everything without saying anything. He nodded slowly. He looked at the retreating steer. Then he looked back at her and said, with the weight of someone saying something they have thought about more than once, "I'm glad you answered that advertisement, Jane Sutton." It was the first time he had used her full name. She felt it land somewhere in the middle of her chest and stay there like a warm stone. She said, "So am I," and walked back to her work and did not look back, and was extremely proud of herself for this. But the atmosphere on the ranch was changing. The steer in the ravine had done something that Cray's antagonism had not counted on, which was to give the rest of the hands a reason to see her differently. Cowboys respected competence the way priests respected scripture. It was the closest thing to a universal currency on the frontier, and Jane had just demonstrated a very specific kind of it in front of 20-odd witnesses. Even Holt, who had mostly treated her with a kind of baffled tolerance, came up to her that evening and said, gruffly and without preamble, "You know what you're doing with cattle. "My father taught me," she said. "Good man," Holt said, and walked away, and she understood this was about as effusive as Holt Briggs ever got, and she was moved by it in a way she hadn't expected. Cray, naturally, took this as a reason to escalate. It happened on a Saturday morning in late March when the full roundup crew was out moving a large section of the herd to the spring pasture. Jane was working the east flank, which was a legitimate post with real responsibility, and she was doing it well enough that no one had reason to question her placement there. Cray came up beside her on horseback and said, low and ugly, "You think you belong here. You think any of these men actually respect you. They're laughing at you behind your back, every one of them." Jane kept her eyes on the cattle. "Then they must be laughing quietly," she said, "because I haven't heard anything." "You're a joke," Cray said. "You're somebody's charity project. The boss feels sorry for you. That's all this is." She felt the words try to find a way in because the thing about betrayal was that it worked best when it touched something you were already afraid of, and she was afraid of that. She was afraid that she was here on sufferance rather than merit, that Gideon Donovan's fairness toward her was pity dressed up as principle. But she had seen her own work. She had done it every day for 5 weeks. And she knew the difference between charity and earned ground, even if Cray was doing his level best to make her forget. "Move off my flank," she said to Cray. "You're spooking the cattle." He stared at her. "Move," she said again, with a calm so absolute it had an edge like iron, "or I'll tell Holt you disrupted the east flank push and we lost 40 head into the brush because you couldn't manage your position. Your choice." Cray stared at her for a long moment with something hot and humiliated in his face. Then he wheeled his horse and rode off, and Jane spent the next hour feeling her heart pound in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. She told Gideon about it that evening because he had asked her to come to him directly. She had thought about not doing it because something in her hated needing to report anything, hated the implication that she couldn't manage her own problems. But she had made an agreement and she honored her agreements. She found him at the east barn, checking one of the horses that had come up slightly lame. She told him what Cray had said, flatly and without embellishment. Gideon listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, his hands still working over the horse's leg with professional attention. Then he said, "What do you want done about it?" She had not expected that. She had expected a decision, not a question. "I want him off my flank," she said. "I don't want him reassigned or punished for my sake. He does good work when he's not playing politics. I just want a clean boundary." Gideon looked at her. "And if he crosses it again, then he's off my flank permanently and we revisit the question." Gideon nodded slowly. "All right," he said, then after a pause, "You're not what I expected." "I imagine not," she said. "I mean that as something good," he said, and the specificity of the clarification, the fact that he felt the need to make sure she understood it as a compliment rather than an observation, told her something she was not yet ready to think about clearly. "Thank you for the position," she said. "I know it wasn't what you expected when you opened the gate." "No," he said. "It wasn't." He paused. "I'm not sorry for it." She nodded, because she didn't trust herself to say anything else without saying too much. And she went back to the bunkhouse and lay on her narrow cot in the dark with the sound of the wind against the boards and let herself feel, privately and completely alone, just for a moment, the weight of how much it meant to be in a place where her work mattered. April unfolded into May and May into June, and the Donovan Ranch moved through its seasonal rhythms with the grinding, beautiful momentum of a place that was genuinely alive. Jane worked every day with the same relentless consistency that she had carried into that first frozen February morning, and the watching that the hands had done in the early weeks slowly transformed from suspicion into something else, something that looked more like respect. She learned the names and habits of every horse in the Donovan string. She could read cattle with an accuracy that impressed Holt, who had been reading cattle since before Jane was born. She learned to use a lasso with a proficiency that had taken her 3 torn palms and 2 spectacular failures before it became something she could trust, and the afternoon that she successfully roped a running steer from a full gallop on her bay mare. a mild-mannered animal named Pepper. Two of the seasonal hands actually applauded, which was not something cowboys did for each other in general, and was therefore significant. She and Gideon developed a rhythm that was professional and careful, and charged with something neither of them acknowledged. He sought her opinion on cattle management with an ease that told her he trusted her judgment, and she gave it honestly without hedging, because she had noticed he did not want softened answers. They worked side by side on dozens of tasks and developed the specific, wordless efficiency of people who had learned each other's movements. But there were things between them that were not professional, small things that accumulated like creek water behind a stone dam. There was the evening in early May when a late storm came through, and they were the only two people in the east barn securing the doors against the wind, and the lightning was close enough to feel. And in the dark and the noise of the storm, he had put his hand briefly on her shoulder to guide her away from a swinging door, and neither of them had moved away from that contact as quickly as the situation required. There was the morning in June when she had been reading her mother's Bible in the early light before work, and he had found her there on the fence rail. And instead of passing by, he had sat on the other rail, and they had talked about Missouri and Kansas, and the particular quality of silence on the plains in the mornings. And the conversation had lasted an hour before either of them realized how late it was. And they had both scrambled toward their respective work, with something flustered and warm in the air between them. There was the afternoon when Pepper went lame on the trail, and Jane had walked her back 4 miles in the heat, and Gideon, who had come back to find her, had ridden beside her on the long walk-in without saying much but without leaving either, and the not leaving had meant more than most conversations she had ever had. She was aware that she was building feelings for Gideon Donovan that were going to be a problem. She was also aware that the specific circumstances of her life made this a luxury she could not afford. She was an employee. She had arrived with $11 and a carpet bag. She had no family, no property, no standing in any community, no dark past that would surface to destroy things, but also no foundation that might make a future possible. She had survived by working, and she would continue to survive by working, and the worst thing she could do was let sentiment scramble the only solid thing she had built. She was therefore working very hard at keeping her feelings in their proper containers, when Gideon Donovan made all of that effort considerably more difficult by doing something unexpected. It was a Sunday in early July. Sundays were the one partial rest day on the ranch, the morning free for those who wanted to attend services in Caldwell, the afternoon given over to maintenance and personal time. Jane had been mending harness leather in the shade of the main barn when Gideon appeared and asked her, with a formality that seemed slightly awkward on him, whether she would like to ride out to the north pasture with him to check on a section of fencing. She looked at him for a moment because she knew perfectly well that fencing checks were not Sunday afternoon work, and that if he needed the north pasture fence checked, he would have sent Holt on Monday morning. "Yes," she said, "I would." They rode out in the long amber light of the July afternoon, through grass that had come up full and green in the summer rains, with the sky enormous and blue overhead, and the Cimarron River visible as a silver thread in the middle distance. They checked perhaps 100 yards of fence, which required about 8 minutes, and then they stood their horses in the meadow and talked for 2 hours. He told her about building the ranch. He had come to Kansas from Ohio at 22 with $200 his father had left him, and a clear-eyed, almost reckless conviction that the cattle business was the future of the American West. He had started with a small herd and a lease on a section of land that no one else wanted because the soil was wrong for farming. He had spent 5 years barely sleeping, building fences and infrastructure with his own hands, learning the cattle trade from anyone who would teach him, making deals and alliances, and building the reputation that now made the Donovan Ranch one of the most respected operations in the Cimarron Valley. He said these things without pride, the way a man describes a journey rather than an achievement. She told him about Missouri in return, about her father's farm and the particular texture of that life, hard and honest and close to the ground. She told him about her father's death and her mother following within 2 months, and she was able to tell it now without the raw edge that had been in it at the beginning of the year. She told him about the bulletin board advertisement and the decision to come west, and he listened in the way he always listened, with his full attention, and without any of the patronizing sympathy that she found so unbearable in people who thought difficulty was something to be apologized for. "You were not afraid?" he asked. "I was terrified," she said honestly, "but terrified in staying felt worse than terrified in moving." He was quiet for a moment. The horses cropped grass. The river caught the late light. "I want to say something to you," he said, "and I want to say it carefully because I don't want to make anything complicated that is working." She felt her pulse do something specific. "All right," she said. He looked out at the river. "You are the most capable person I have on this ranch," he said, "and I mean that without exception and without qualification. Holt knows that and most of the hands know it now, but that is not the thing I wanted to say." She waited. He turned and looked at her. "I think about you considerably more than I think about my foreman or my hands," he said, "and I am aware that this is a different kind of thinking. And I am also aware that you came here for work, and that your independence and your standing here are things you have earned absolutely, and I would never want anything I say or do to put a shadow on that." Jane Sutton had spent the better part of her adult life building walls, because the frontier was not a place that rewarded vulnerability in women, and she had learned early that the only armor available to her was competence and self-possession. She felt those walls doing the thing they were designed to do, organizing this declaration into something manageable, something she could categorize and set aside. But she had also spent the last 5 months learning the specific honest quality of Gideon Donovan, and she recognized that what he had just done was take a genuine risk in the service of honesty, and she had too much respect for honest things to hide behind her walls at the expense of one. "I think about you considerably more than I think about my work," she said, "which is notable, because I think about my work a great deal." The look he gave her then was the most unguarded thing she had seen on his face in 5 months, and it moved her past the point where she had language for it. They rode back to the ranch in the warm darkness, not touching, but with something entirely different in the air between them than had been there on the ride out. July and August were the months when everything accelerated, when the hidden motives of several people on the ranch came into the open and made what might have been a simple and beautiful thing considerably more complicated. The first complication arrived in the form of a man named Ashford Crane. Crane was a cattle broker from Wichita with financial interests in 3 ranches in the valley, and a particular interest in acquiring a 4th, which happened to be the Donovan Ranch. He arrived at the ranch in late July with a business proposition that Gideon had already refused twice by letter, and was prepared to refuse again in person. He was a well-dressed man of about 45 with the smooth, calibrated manner of someone who had made a career out of getting people to agree to things they hadn't planned to agree to. And he had the particular skill of identifying the pressure points in a situation and applying force to them with a smile. He noticed Jane within the first hour of his visit. What Jane did not know, and what Gideon found out through a remark that Crane made over supper that first evening, was that Crane had a specific plan in motion. He had, in the weeks before his visit, been quietly spreading a story among the ranchers and businessmen of the Cimarron Valley that the Donovan Ranch had financial problems that Gideon was concealing. This was entirely false, but it was the kind of false thing that, once introduced into the conversations of nervous men, could create the very problems it claimed to describe. The story was a trap, carefully constructed. If Gideon heard about it and said nothing, the rumors would consolidate. If he confronted it publicly and denied it, denial of rumors on the frontier had a specific way of sounding like the truth of them. Either way, Crane was positioning himself to offer a buyout at a deflated price to a man who was going to look financially vulnerable regardless of what he did. What Crane had not factored into his plan was Jane Sutton. Jane heard about the rumors from Holt, who heard them from a rider coming up from one of the neighboring ranches with a message. The rider, a young man who liked talking more than most people on the frontier, had mentioned almost in passing that there was some concern among ranchers about Donovan's financial position, that there was talk of debts he wasn't disclosing. Jane went to Gideon that evening and told him what she had heard. She watched his face cycle through several things: the specific controlled anger of a proud man whose reputation had been attacked, and something else underneath it that looked like the weight of a man who had built something with his whole life and was watching someone try to take it apart. "Where is it coming from?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, "but it's organized. It's the same story in the same words from two different directions. Someone is running it deliberately." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Crane." "That was my thought," she said. He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this." "Since Holt told me this afternoon," she said. "There's a way to address it." He waited. She had been thinking about this for several hours with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, turning the problem over and looking at it from every available angle. "The livestock auction," she said. "You've been planning to host it here in August. Every rancher in the valley will be here. Every buyer. The auction itself is a demonstration of the ranch's health. It is a public event with real commerce behind it, real numbers, real cattle, real buyers. You can't directly deny a rumor without giving it oxygen, but you can make a rumor irrelevant by demonstrating so clearly and publicly that the thing the rumor describes is false that no reasonable person continues to believe it." He was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read. "You host the auction," she said. "You make it the best, most professionally run auction this valley has ever seen. You sell cattle at good prices in good numbers, and you do it in front of everyone. Crane's rumor dies not because you killed it, but because reality killed it." Gideon was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "And Crane, he'll know what you've done," she said. "He'll know his plan failed. I imagine he leaves the valley after that." "And if he stays," Gideon asked, "then you find out what his actual motive is, which may be something besides the ranch." He nodded slowly. He looked at her with that particular steady attention that she had come to understand meant he was genuinely engaged with what she was saying, not just waiting for her to finish. "When did you get to be so strategic?" he asked. "I had to think around things my whole life," she said. "When you don't have direct power, you learn to think sideways." He said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "I'm sorry for that." She was startled. "For what?" That's what your life required," he said. She felt the words land somewhere private and completely undefended. She said, after a moment, "Don't be sorry. It made me useful." "You are a great deal more than useful," he said, and this time neither of them looked away. The August auction was announced at 2 weeks' notice, and the preparations consumed the ranch in a productive, clarifying way that Jane found deeply satisfying. There was livestock to be sorted and certified and presented, infrastructure to be maintained, arrangements to be made for the buyers and ranchers who would travel from across the valley. Jane threw herself into it with the energy of someone who understood that this mattered in layers, for the ranch, for Gideon, and for the specific satisfaction of watching a trap built for someone you respected dismantle itself in public. It was during the auction preparations that Cray made his final mistake. Jane was in the process of managing the sorting of a large group of steers for presentation when Cray, who had apparently spent the week since their confrontation on the east flank building a new grievance, walked into the middle of the operation and began countermanding her directions to the men she was working with. It was not subtle. It was not accidental. It was the specific move of a man who had decided that if he could not break her, he would simply override her in front of enough witnesses to make the precedent stick. Several of the men looked between them with the uncomfortable expression of people who could see a collision coming and had no idea which direction to clear. Jane stopped what she was doing. She turned and looked at Cray with the full weight of 7 months of earned ground behind her. "You are not in charge of this sorting," she said. "I am. If you have a problem with that, take it to Holt or take it to Mr. Donovan. If you countermand me again in front of these men while I am doing my work, I will consider that a declaration that we cannot work on this ranch at the same time, and I will leave the question of who stays to Mr. Donovan." Cray's face had gone through several colors. "You don't have that kind of authority," he said. "Then let's find out," she said. She walked to the main house and knocked on the door, and when Gideon opened it, she said, flatly and without emotion, "Cray is undermining my direction of the auction sorting in front of the crew. I said I would put the decision of who stays to you, so I'm here." Gideon looked at her for one moment. He walked out of the house, across the yard and into the sorting pen, and the men who saw him coming stepped back slightly because there was something in his walk that communicated a finality of decision. He looked at Cray. He said without raising his voice, "Jane Sutton is managing the sorting operation for the auction. Her directions to the crew are my directions. If you cannot work under that condition, I will pay your wages through today and you can be gone before supper. That is the complete scope of your choices." Cray stared at him. Something in the big man's face went through a very specific sequence that ended in something that might have been the first genuine crack in his certainty. He left the ranch that afternoon, not because he was fired, technically, but because he could not absorb the fact that the authority he had spent 6 years cultivating had been superseded, cleanly and publicly, by a woman who had arrived with a carpet bag. Some of the remaining hands watched him go with expressions that were not entirely sympathetic. Holt came to stand beside Jane as Cray's horse disappeared down the road and said, "Took long enough." "You knew he was going to be a problem?" she asked. "Known since February," Holt said. He squinted at the dust Cray's horse had raised. "Didn't figure you'd still be here to outlast him." "I'm hard to move," she said. Holt made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had ever heard from him. "So I've noticed," he said, and walked back to his work. The auction arrived on a hot, brilliant Thursday morning in late August, and with it came nearly 60 people, ranchers and buyers and townspeople, and 3 of the most significant cattle brokers in the Cimarron Valley. They came on horseback and in wagons, and 2 of them came in a buggy that had seen better decades, and the Donovan Ranch received them all with a competence and abundance that told anyone paying attention that the rumors about financial distress were exactly the fictional construction Jane had suspected. Ashford Crane came too, because a man running a trap of that kind always showed up to watch the results. Jane noticed him immediately and watched him in the way you watch a man you know is dangerous, with your whole attention given the appearance of being somewhere else. She watched him move through the crowd in the first hour of the auction, watched him talking to the ranchers and buyers, watched his face for the moment when he understood that what he had built was not working. It came about 40 minutes into the auction, when the second group of steers went at a price considerably higher than the valley average, and the buyer shook Gideon's hand with obvious satisfaction, and the crowd around them had the specific animated energy of people who were witnessing a genuinely healthy operation at full stride. She saw Crane's face do the calculation. She saw him arrive at the result. He was not a man who showed much, but she saw it, the small contraction around the eyes, the way his hand moved to his drink and he took a careful sip rather than reacting. She was walking toward the herd pens to check on a matter of logistics when Crane stepped into her path. He was smooth about it, making it look like an accidental meeting in the way practiced men made deliberate things look accidental. He introduced himself with the practiced pleasantry of a businessman and said something complimentary about the organization of the event. "Thank you," she said. "You've been here, what, 6 months?" he asked, as though he had not specifically inquired into her history. "7," she said. "Remarkable," he said, with a warmth that did not reach his eyes. "Tell me, do you find the work here satisfying? A woman of your apparent capabilities might find more opportunity in a city." "I find the work here exactly satisfying," she said, And I've found that the people who suggest I might be better off somewhere else usually mean they'd be better off with me somewhere else." The warmth in his face dropped by approximately half a degree. It was subtle. She caught it. "Not at all," he said. "I simply meant to say that your abilities are perhaps not fully recognized in a ranching context." "Mr. Donovan recognizes them quite fully," she said. "Enjoy the auction." She walked on. She found Gideon an hour later near the main pen and told him about the conversation, the way she always told him things directly and without softening them. He listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that surprised her. "Did he threaten you?" "No," she said. "He was fishing." "For what?" She thought about it. "For whether I could be used, whether I had loyalty that could be purchased or directed elsewhere." She looked at him. "He knows the rumors failed. I think he may have believed that the ranch's value to him was your distraction or your weakened position. He's looking for another angle." Gideon's jaw was set in that way that meant the controlled anger was very close to the surface. "He won't find one," he said. "No," she agreed. "He won't." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, low and with a private quality that cut through the noise of the auction crowd around them, "I don't know how I ran this place before you." She felt the warmth of that go through her like sunlight through glass. "Very well, I imagine," she said. "You built all of this before I arrived." "I built it," he said. "You made me see it properly." He paused. "Jane, I would like to ask you something that has nothing to do with this ranch." She felt the world do a slight, specific shift. "All right," she said. He looked down at the fence post he had his hand on, then back at her, with something direct and completely open in his face. "I would like to court you," he said. "Properly. With the full weight of what that means and with the intention of being serious about it. I am not asking you to change anything about your work or your standing here. I am asking whether you would allow me to be something more to you than your employer." Jane Sutton stood in the August sun with the sound of the auction around her, and the smell of the cattle and the grass, and she felt everything she had been so carefully containing for 7 months move through the walls she had built against it with the quiet, unstoppable force of a river that has finally found its course. "Yes," she said. "I would allow that." He smiled then, fully and without the reserved quality he usually carried, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. It was approximately 1 hour after this conversation that Gideon stood on the top rail of the split-cedar fence in front of all those people and said what he said. She had not expected it. What had led to the moment was this. One of the older ranchers in the crowd, a man named Fitch who had been watching Jane work all morning with visible skepticism, had made a comment within Gideon's hearing. He had said to another man standing near him that it was all well and good for Donovan to humor a woman on his ranch, but that it set a troubling example for the legitimate working culture of the valley, and that charitable gestures of that kind, however admirable, ought not to be mistaken for merit. Gideon had heard this. He had turned and looked at Fitch for one long, measured moment, and then he had climbed the fence. He had not planned it. It was not a speech. It was the particular, absolute response of a man who had been patient with the assumptions of other people for as long as patience had any value. "She arrived with nothing," he said, loud enough for all 60 people to hear. "Not a coin to her name, not a single soul in this territory who would vouch for her, and she outworked every man here." The silence was enormous. He looked out at the crowd. "She fixed fence in February temperatures that kept the rest of you inside. She settled cattle that 3 experienced hands couldn't approach. She managed the sorting and organization of this auction with a professionalism that none of you have had cause to criticize. She faced deliberate hostility from people on this ranch who wanted her gone, and she stood her ground with more dignity than those people showed her. She is the finest working hand I have employed in 10 years of this ranch, and she is more capable, more honest, and more genuinely useful than most of the men I see standing in this yard." He paused and looked directly at Fitch. "Charitable gesture," he said, with a quiet that was more cutting than any volume. "The only gesture of charity in this situation is the one she extended to all of us when she chose to stay." He climbed down from the fence. The crowd was absolutely still for a moment. Then several things happened at once. Some of the hands began to applaud, not wildly, but with the specific, solid appreciation of men who meant it. Several of the ranchers near Fitch looked at him with expressions that suggested a reconsideration of standing near him. Fitch himself had the expression of a man who had just understood something at significant personal cost. Holt, standing off to Jane's left, said nothing, but crossed his arms with a satisfaction so complete it was visible from 20 feet. And Ashford Crane, standing at the edge of the crowd, looked at Gideon Donovan on his way down from the fence and understood with absolute clarity that every angle he had attempted to find on this ranch had just been closed off completely and permanently. He was gone before the auction ended. No farewell, no word, just a horse on the south road getting smaller. Jane stood with the cooling branding iron in her gloved hand and looked at Gideon across the yard, and what was moving through her was something so large and complicated that she had no category for it. There was gratitude, which was the simplest part of it. There was the specific, private warmth of being seen by someone you deeply respected. There was an emotion that she recognized, with something like fear and something like joy in equal measure, as love. She did not go to him immediately. She finished her work, because she was Jane Sutton and finishing her work was not something she abandoned for any reason. But when the auction was winding down and the crowd was dispersing and the light was going gold in the west, she found him at the barn where he was settling horses for the evening. "You didn't tell me you were going to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "You could have warned me." "I didn't decide until I heard Fitch," he said. "You could have just told me what Fitch said," she said. He looked at her. "I could have," he said, "but I wanted you to know what I think of your work in front of the people who needed to hear it." She looked back at him. "What you said was very generous," she said. "It was true," he said. "There is a difference." She set the branding iron down on the bench beside her and looked at him in the fading light of that August day. 7 months. She had arrived with $11 and a carpet bag, and a refusal to be finished. She had built something here with her own hands and her own determination, and the man across from her had built something alongside her that neither of them had planned for. "Gideon," she said. "Yes," he said, as if he already knew what she was going to say. "I love you," she said, simply because she had never been able to say things she meant with anything but simplicity. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps, and she had approximately 1 second to appreciate the intention in his face before he kissed her. And it was the kind of kiss that had 7 months of careful restraint behind it, and was therefore not simple or careful at all. And she felt everything she had been holding behind her walls come down at once in the most complete and irreversible way. When they separated, she was slightly unsteady, which was a condition she was not accustomed to and found entirely acceptable. "I love you," he said, with his hands on her face and his eyes on hers. "I have been trying to find a proper moment to say that for approximately 4 months. "You found one," she said. He smiled against her forehead. "Somewhat publicly," he said. "I think the public part is over," she said. "Good," he said, "because the rest of what I want to say is private." September came and the work continued, because on a working cattle ranch the seasons did not pause for love, and Jane and Gideon understood this about each other in the way 2 people who have both built their lives from real work understand it. What changed was the texture of the days, the fact that they no longer navigated the distance between them with careful professional architecture, that they could sit together in the evenings and talk about the work and the ranch and the future without the weight of unsaid things between them. Holt observed all of this with the expression of a man who had seen it coming since approximately March and had the wisdom to say nothing, which made him, in Jane's estimation, nearly perfect. The hands who remained after Cray's departure had settled into a working culture that Jane had helped shape over 7 months, and it was a better culture than it had been before her arrival, more honest and more efficient, and considerably less prone to the petty politics that Cray had cultivated. Several of the men had developed a specific, respectful camaraderie with Jane that was different from the way men related to each other but was genuine and solid, and she valued it accordingly. October arrived, and with it the end of the working season, when the herd was brought in from summer pasture and counted and prepared for winter. It was the kind of work that required every hand and every skill on the ranch, and which Jane threw herself into with the same completeness she brought to everything. And it was during the last days of this work that Gideon asked her to walk with him to the north pasture on a Sunday evening. She knew this route. She went with the particular awareness of someone who understood that important things had a way of repeating their settings. He had brought her mother's Bible with him, which startled her until she understood why. He had found it on the fence rail where she sometimes sat with it in the mornings, and he had picked it up intending to bring it to her. And in carrying it across the yard, he had opened it and found, pressed between 2 pages, a letter in her mother's handwriting that was partly a list of things Jane would need to remember, and partly a benediction that said, in the particular tender practicality of a mother who knew she was dying, that Jane was strong enough for whatever came. And that love was not a weakness, but the specific kind of courage that came after all other courage had been tested. He handed her the Bible. He waited while she read her mother's letter, which she had read so many times she had it memorized, but which still, on an October evening in the north pasture of the Donovan Ranch, moved her past the point where she could keep her face entirely still. When she looked up, he was on one knee in the autumn grass. He was holding a ring that was simple and gold, and had been his mother's, which he had carried from Ohio 11 years ago in the same way she had carried her mother's Bible from Missouri. Jane Sutton, he said, with the specific, absolute honesty that was the best thing about him, I have been certain of very few things in my life beyond the work I have built here. You are the most certain thing I have ever been of. I would like you to be my wife, and my partner in everything this ranch is and everything it will become, and the person I talk to in the evenings about things that matter and things that don't, for the rest of my life. Will you have me? She crouched down in front of him because she would not let him kneel while she stood at the most important moment of her life, and she took the ring from his hand and held it for a moment between both of her hands and felt the weight of everything that had brought her to this October meadow, the stage to Caldwell, the frozen February gate, the barbed wire fence, the steer in the ravine, the north pasture rides, all of it, and she understood that none of it had been an accident. Yes, she said, I will have you. Completely. He put the ring on her finger, and she kissed him in the long amber light of the October evening with the river silver in the distance and the cattle visible as dark shapes in the deepening grass. And there was nothing hidden between them anymore. No secrets, no distances, no careful containers holding things back. Just 2 people who had both arrived at this life with nothing but work and will, and had found, entirely unexpectedly, that they had arrived at the same place. They married in November, in the Caldwell church, in a ceremony that was attended by most of the working population of the Cimarron Valley, and by every hand on the Donovan Ranch, and by Holt Briggs, who wore an expression of profound satisfaction throughout the entire proceedings, and cried very quietly during the vows in a way that he denied afterward to anyone who mentioned it. The winter after their wedding was the warmest winter the Kansas plains had seen in a decade, which Jane took as a personal sign from her mother. The first year of their marriage was the best year Jane Sutton had ever lived. She continued working the ranch because the ranch was who she was, and Gideon had never asked her to be anyone but who she was. And the working side by side that had been the foundation of everything between them remained the daily texture of their life. They made decisions together about the ranch, with the natural, efficient partnership of 2 people who trusted each other's judgment absolutely. And the Donovan Ranch in the year of 1879 had never been more productive or more smoothly run. She also began to understand, in the way you only fully understand a thing when you are living it from the inside, what Gideon had built here. It was not just a cattle operation. It was a living community, a set of relationships and responsibilities and loyalties that extended far beyond the fence lines. The men who worked for them had lives that were connected to the decisions Gideon and Jane made, and she felt the weight of that responsibility with a seriousness that he recognized and respected. There were still the small injustices of the world outside the ranch. The moments in Caldwell where certain men took a particular pleasure in addressing her as Donovan's wife, rather than as a person in her own right. The assumption in some quarters that her capabilities had been something her husband had generously attributed to her rather than something she actually possessed. She dealt with these the way she dealt with most things, directly, without drama, and with the quiet advantage of someone who had stopped needing other people's recognition to know her own worth. She also had moments that were purely funny. A county official who came to the ranch on some bureaucratic matter and spent 20 minutes trying to direct his questions to Gideon on a subject where Jane had all the relevant information, until Gideon said pleasantly, "My wife handles this. She is the person you want to be talking to." And the man's expression had undergone a very complete and educational revision. In the spring of 1879, Jane discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Gideon in the evening after supper, sitting on the porch of the main house in the warm April air, and his reaction was the most transparent and unguarded she had ever seen him, an immediate, complete joy that moved across his face with nothing held back, and he took her hands in both of his and held them the way you hold something you are afraid of losing and also completely certain of keeping. "Are you well?" was the first thing he asked. "Very well," she said. "Better than well." "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "But I was frightened in February of 1878, and that turned out better than I could have imagined." He laughed, which was a sound she had come to love the way you love the particular sound of water in a specific creek. Their son was born in November of 1879, a solid, loud, healthy boy that they named Robert, after Jane's father. He had Gideon's dark hair and Jane's green eyes, and the temperament of someone who had decided he had opinions and intended to express them, which made both of his parents suspect he was going to be extremely good at running a cattle ranch. Holt held the baby with the profound, terrified care of a man who had never held a baby in his life, and looked at Robert with an expression of such complete wonder that Jane committed it to memory as one of the finest things she had ever seen. The ranch expanded in 1880. They hired 3 additional permanent hands and acquired a section of land adjacent to the north pasture that significantly increased their spring grazing capacity. Jane managed the integration of the new land into the ranch's operations with the same organized thoroughness she brought to everything, and the resulting increase in the herd's productivity in the following season vindicated the investment entirely. Gideon told her one evening that year that she was the best business decision he had ever made, and she told him that she was not a business decision, and he said no, she was absolutely not. She was the best decision of any kind he had ever made, and she decided to accept this. Little Robert was a toddler of 2 when his sister arrived in the spring of 1882, a daughter they named Clara, who had Jane's dark hair and Gideon's brown eyes, and a serene, observant quality that made her parents look at each other sometimes with the private, astonished recognition of people who had made something extraordinary. The years folded one into the next with the warm, productive momentum of a life that was genuinely working. The Donovan Ranch became what Gideon had always believed it could be, one of the most respected cattle operations in the whole of the Cimarron Valley, known not only for the quality of its herd, but for the quality of the people who ran it. Jane's reputation in the valley transformed over those years in the way reputations transform when they are built on something real. The women who had initially regarded her with a mixture of pity and incomprehension came to know her as someone whose judgment they sought. The ranchers who had watched Gideon's auction speech with skeptical faces came to acknowledge, through the evidence of years, that he had been telling the plain truth. The new hands who arrived at the Donovan Ranch after 1879 arrived already knowing that Jane Sutton Donovan was someone whose directions meant something, and this knowledge was so established that it required no defense. One afternoon in the summer of 1883, when Robert was 3 years old and Clara was a year old, and the ranch was at the height of its summer operations, a young woman appeared at the gate of the Donovan Ranch on foot, with a carpet bag roughly the size of a man's boot, asking for work. Her name was Miriam Cole. She was 21, from Texas originally, with the look of someone who had traveled a very long way on very little. She had heard that the Donovan Ranch hired on merit and intended to hold to that standard regardless of what she was. Jane Sutton Donovan came out to meet her at the gate. She looked at Miriam Cole and the carpet bag and the long road behind her, and she recognized everything she saw. "Come in," she said. "We'll talk about your experience and then we'll find you something to eat." Miriam Cole looked at her with the particular expression of someone who had prepared to fight for entrance and had not expected to simply be welcomed, and Jane understood exactly what that expression meant. "It gets easier," Jane said quietly. "The beginning is the hardest part." "How long were you here before it got easier?" Miriam asked. Jane thought about February of 1878, the frozen ground and the carpet bag and Holt's baffled stare and Gideon's careful, dark-eyed assessment. "A few months," she said, "but you don't have to do it alone the way I did. I'll make sure of that." She hired Miriam Cole, who turned out to have a specific and remarkable talent with horses that made Holt grudgingly declare her the best natural horsewoman he had seen in 30 years, which was, coming from Holt, essentially a standing ovation. Miriam Cole stayed on the Donovan Ranch, and 2 years later she married the young hand named Davis, who had been the first person to applaud when Jane roped the running steer from Pepper's back in the spring of 1878, and that story became the kind of ranch story that gets told for generations. But that is a story for another time. The story of Jane Sutton ends where it is always meant to end, which is not with an ending at all but with the particular, specific rightness of a life that has arrived at itself. It ends on an October evening in 1883, 5 years almost to the day from that first February morning. When Jane and Gideon sat on the porch of the main house, with the last of the evening light going amber over the Cimarron Flats, and the river a silver thread in the distance and Robert building, something complicated and argumentative in the yard with a set of wooden blocks, and Clara asleep against Jane's chest, with the total confidence of a child who has never needed to question where she belongs. The ranch was quiet in the particular way it got quiet at this hour, the working day behind it and the night not yet arrived, a pause that felt like the land breathing. Gideon had his arm around Jane's shoulders in the easy, habitual way of someone who had been doing this for 5 years and intended to do it for 50 more, and he was looking out at the flats with the expression of a man who is completely in his life. "You know what I think about sometimes," he said. "Tell me," she said. "February of 1878, he said. "The morning you came through that gate." She looked at him, and I almost said no," he said quietly, "because of the expectation. Because of what I thought the hands would say and what the neighboring ranchers would think and what it would mean to do something that nobody was doing." He paused. "I am so profoundly grateful that I didn't." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Clara shifted in her sleep and made a small sound of complete contentment. "I know what you mean," Jane said. "I almost didn't write the letter." "Why didn't you stop yourself?" he asked. "Because terrified and staying felt worse than terrified and moving," she said. "Same as always." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I love you," he said. "I want you to know that I mean that word more every year." "I didn't know love was something that kept growing." "Neither did I," she said. Robert knocked over his wooden structure in the yard and made a sound of magnificent outrage. Clara slept through it. The river caught the last of the light. Jane Sutton, who had arrived in a frozen February with $11 and a carpet bag and a refusal to be finished, sat on the porch of the life she had built with her own hands and the hands of the man who had seen her clearly from the beginning, and felt, In the amber October evening of 1883, the precise and total weight of a happiness she had earned completely. The stars came up over the Cimarron Flats one by one, the way they always did, with the patient and particular certainty of things that have always been there and intend to remain. And the night settled over the Donovan Ranch with the quiet abundance of a life that was, in every way that mattered, completely and irreversibly whole.